this episode, we're going to get into a nice, thorough explanation of how require works. But if you just want the quick and dirty of it, here's how it works. This is the too long did not watch version. First of all, you've seen require before. When you run a require without a slash or a dot slash in front of it, it's going to look in the node modules folder of your current directory. If it doesn't find it there, it's going to go up and look for the node modules folder and look for the thing that you require, and so forth on up to the root. If you want to include a file in the same directory or something relative to where you currently are, you put a dot slash in front of it and then build your path. Now, when you're inside of a module, modules come back as the return value from require, and by default that's just sort of a blank object. You can attach properties to that object by using the exports variable convenience helper that collects properties to attach to the module that you are returning. However, if you want to redefine the actual object that gets returned to something else that is not that default blank object, you can do so using module.exports from within your module. And that's the quick version. Keep watching to see. Now comes that difficult moment when we have to admit that the single file program that we've been working on is completely out of hand. In this one file, we have all of our route handlers crammed in there with all of our route definitions and our middleware declarations, along with the call that actually starts our server. And this is just too difficult to work with. We want to see how we can break an app into multiple files. We probably have some idea that this can happen because of this require statement that we've seen before when we include express. And in this episode, we're going to see how that actually works. So the first thing that we need to consider is that the node module system is based on CommonJS, and you can read all about CommonJS at commonjs.org. We are not going to do that right now, but some Friday night when you're out with your friends looking for some kicks, well, hey, problem is solved. Y'all can read CommonJS together. So when we type require express, what exactly is going on here? Very first thing, require is a function. It's a globally accessible function, so you don't have to pass it to any other file to get access to it, but it is just a function, and it takes arguments, and it has a return value. So this argument that we pass to it is express, the string, and notice that it's just express, not dot slash express or slash express. And this has a particular meaning when we are requiring a file. If you remember, we have in our project a package file. And in that package file, we defined a dependency on express. And then after we had defined that, we did an npm install. And what that created for us was a directory called node modules. And inside of there, we have a folder named express. That seems to match this. If we were to look inside of that folder named express, we would see that it also has a package file, and that inside of that package file there's a key named main with a value of index. So what is happening here? When we call require and we don't put the dot slash or the slash in front of it, what node does is pretty simple. It starts in the current directory and looks for a node modules directory, which we have. Then it's going to look inside of that directory for a name that matches the argument that we pass to it, which in this case it does. Upon discovering that this is a folder and not a file, it's going to look in that folder for a package.json file, and it will look in that package.json for the main that we just pointed out. And since that main points to an index file, it is going to use that index file as the thing to return to us. And we'll look at just a second what that actually means to return this to us. But this is the file that node finds. Okay, that's all well and good, but what would happen if we hadn't had express in that node modules folder where it was? Let's have some fun here just to try to trip things up. A level up from our project, we're going to make another node modules folder, and then just for fun, we're going to move express into that one. And now, this time, we're going to start our server, and of course the whole thing is going to blow up, right? Well, shucks, it looks like nothing is different there. Let's have a look at our browser and see if it works. Here we are in the browser, and oh man, that looks exactly like it should. How did that work? Well, this one's pretty simple. Remember how we said that when you don't pass in the dot slash or the slash, it looks in the current directory for node modules and then looks for Express. Well, when it looks there, if it doesn't find it, it's going to go up one level. So it's going to go from episode 0007 up to Tecodes. And in that folder, we made another node modules folder where we put Express. So it went up a level and tried again. If it hadn't found it there, can you see where this is going? It's going to keep doing that all the way back up to a node modules folder off the root. If it doesn't find it, then it's going to say, I couldn't find it, and give you an error. So to summarize, when we don't put in the dot slash or the slash, it looks in the current directory in node modules and then starts walking up back up to the root of the file system, checking for node modules folders all the way back on and up. And if you had a file in your node modules that matched the name, it would import that one. The reason it looked into the package file in Express is because Express was a folder and not a file. Now there is one exception to this rule, and it's a very good exception, and you might have seen that here when we did an ls of our node modules. I made a silly little HTTP quote-unquote module there, and let's have a look at it. So we look at node modules, HTTP. Hey, it even has a package file, so it must be legit, right? And there's the message that it will run if this thing gets included. So let's come back over to our application code, and we'll do a require HTTP. Restart our server, and notice that we don't see this console log file being run. Why is that one? Well, HTTP, if you remember from, it was either episode 1 or 2, is one of the core Node libraries. That one's baked right into Node and is quite an important one. Express uses connect under the hood, which in turn uses HTTP. If the module that you are requiring is a Node core module, then it's going to completely ignore anything in your Node modules folder that matches the name of that. And the core modules always take precedence over everything else. And consider how important that is from a security standpoint. Do you really want the Haxord version of HTTP? I sure don't, and I bet your customers submitting their credit card numbers don't want that either. Okay, so now for a little bit of bookkeeping here, we are going to move Express back into our current folder just because whatever, that's where we're putting it. And now we're going to look at how to use require with files in our own directory. Okay, so the next episode is going to talk about a nice app structure for applications in general, which we're not going to do this time. So just for the sake of illustration today, our goal is to get the route handlers into their own file, to get the middleware declarations into their own file, and then to get the route definitions into their own file. So let's start with the route handlers, and we'll come up here and we'll open a file called handlers. And here's a nice file, and let's write it just for good measure. Now let us require that file and see what we get. The important thing here is / because we're in the current directory. And then, just to see what this is, we're going to do a console log on handlers. And then we will restart our server. And here's our output from that. It's an object. Happens to be an empty one, but it looks like just a standard JavaScript object. Okay, that's going to get kind of ugly though if we have to put this extension on here all the time. What happens if we just pull that off? We restart our server, and no problem. Why is that? Well, if it doesn't find an exact match for the string that you passed in this case it doesn't, because we passed in handlers and the file that exists is handlers.js, Node is going to try to add an extension onto what we gave to it until it does find a match. And that extension can be .js for a JavaScript file. It can be .json for a JSON file. And there's one other option that gets a little bit beyond where we are right now. And that is the .node extension, which is used for compiled add-on modules. And we are definitely not talking about those at this stage of the game. Now let's just reinforce two concepts here real quick. The first is that require is a function with a return value, which means that we can just pass that to another function, in this case console.log, and also that require will work with JSON files. So now when we restart the server, we can see that it outputs the contents of our JSON file, which, if we wanted programmatic access to those contents, pretty easy to get there. And now we're going to have some fun. Here we have just our handlers.js file, and over here we have our code. Let's get rid of the package call there. Now, when you are inside of a module, you can obviously run whatever code you want. So I'll just put here I am. And if we were to restart the server, we can see here I am. Great. But that doesn't really help us get anything visible to the outside world. What we saw earlier from requiring the module was that it looks a whole lot like just a blank object. So how could we assign properties to that object? Well, that's pretty easy. When we're inside of a module, there is this exports variable here to which we can assign properties. So here I'll just put one called the answer, and I can set that equal to 42. And this time I restart the server, and look at that. Now I have this property here, the answer, with value of 42. Okay, that's great, but let's say I didn't want just an object coming back from my module. What happens if I say wanted a function? Well, that's pretty easy. Inside of our module, we also have access to something called module.exports. Now when we set a value to this property on module, we're not attaching something to what our module returns. We are actually defining what the object is that our module returns. So if I were to do this and then remove that part and then rerun the server, notice here now it's just the number 42. This would suggest that doing something like this is equivalent to having no code in there at all. So just for a quick review, when we required the empty function, it passed us back an empty object. We were able to attach properties to that object by using the exports variable that's available in our module, and that took our blank object and attached the answer to it with a value of 42. By using module.exports, rather than attaching properties to the object that's being returned, we actually redefined what gets returned from this module. By including this line of code, instead of an object with the property of the answer, we actually said that this module is now just returning the number 42. Now I promised we'd show a function, so let's do that real quick. We can have this be a function, and it just console logs 42. So now this time when we call require, the return value from this function is this function. So now we can actually use handlers like a function because that's what it is. And when we restart our server, we get 42 exactly like we expected. There is one last caveat that we need to consider here. What would happen if we had an assignment to exports in the same file where we have a call to module.exports? And what would happen if we did something really weird like this? And let's, instead of calling that, let's go on the safe side and just console.log it. What do we get? Well, we see that we get a function with the name of the answer. Why is that? There's a great article at hacksparrow.com which goes into the detail on this, but let's look at it really quick. When we are working in a function like this, module.exports refers to the real deal, as Hacksparrow says it. This is the thing that is actually getting returned from our module to the require call. Exports is a convenience helper that collects properties and attaches them to this real deal unless we have redefined what that real deal is. So our execution flow here is that we were starting with an empty object, then we attached export or the answer to that object. Then we redefined what our module is returning. So this statement is essentially ignored and has no effect for the outside world to see. And now for the bonus round, within our file here, we have a closure. So if I wanted to do something like this, that of course is not going to be accessible to the outside world, but let me give this a different name. I could do something like this. Get rid of this. And now, instead of console log, go back to actually calling the function. When we run the server this time, we see that answer of 42 in there. So if you wanted to have data hiding here, you can achieve it in the module system, which brings us to the next important point, in that these files are cached, and it's cached at the level of what the file name refers to. And what does that mean? Well, let's suppose that instead of 42, this was set to 41, and then immediately after that, we increment this, and then we'll just output what the current value for that is. And we can just get rid of that call right there. When we run it, we see that it is 42, which is exactly what we expect. We started at 41, we incremented it, and then we output what the current value is. All right, so what happens then if we require it twice? We only see it output once because this value is cached. What does this imply? Well, if your module had to do some really heavy processing to get itself set up, that's okay because it's only going to happen once. And what I meant by this is cached at the level of what it resolves to. I meant that as opposed to the actual string passed in, because those two strings are different and yet they're pointing to the same file. And when we run the server, we get the same result, because since it's pointing to the same file, this is only run one time. All right, great. With all of that done, now we can actually clean up our code. So let's gut this file real quick because we don't actually want any of it. We come over here, grab our route handlers, and make sure we don't go too far. Put those into place, and then do a little search and replace magic. And voila, we are choosing the exports approach here. So we just took all those functions and assigned them to exports. So here we've already required our handlers. So we would come down here, and in front of most of these, we would put handlers dot. And this, of course, is not a route handler. Then we restart our server. And a slight goof there. This one also is not a route handler. And now we can come back to our server and reload the page, and everything is just fine. Next, we want to get all of our middleware out into its own file. So we will open one called middleware. And then into this file, we're going to grab a whole lot of stuff here. And we'll paste it into our middleware file. Now for this one, it's a little bit tricky because we don't have any reference to app or express here. And this is where module.exports comes in handy, because we're going to do a function here that takes two parameters, app and express. Simple enough. And now we can require that one. Again with the dot slash. And this time, we'll have to actually call that function, passing into it app and express. Now we can come and restart our server. And we get an error that we expect because read from DB is actually used as a route handler. So that should be right here in this file. Which means that over here, this should actually have been handlers.readFromDB. And then we get one more error. And when we look at it, we can see it's with ensure authenticated. And ensure authenticated, we pulled over into the middlewares file, which let's just put it in its own authenticated. And then we'll come back up here, grab that function, put it here, module.exports equals that like so, and then require it like so. And now when we restart our server, we get one more syntax error because it's module and not modules. Now everything restarts just the way we expect it, and we can reload our page. Now just to complete things out, we have this file here, routes.js, and into there we're going to put our routes. Surprise, surprise. This of course needs to be wrapped up in a function. This function is going to take two parameters, handlers and app. Let's get our indentation going here. And then of course we will need to require it on this side. And then we can just call it right here, passing it app and handlers. Then we restart our server, come back to our page, and presto, it works. Now I'm certainly not going to claim that this is the best app layout ever. However, I do think it's a big step above where we were before, because now we at least have the different concerns of this application separated into different files. And our real goal here was to show how require works. With that knowledge, next week then we're going to break this down and show a much better app structure that's really going to separate the ideas out, make it easy to find what we're looking for. Now there is one last promise that I didn't deliver on, and that was having a look in Express, his index file. We were going to explain how this worked. So remember, module exports is redefining what this module is going to export, and we simply here do a branch on an environment variable, express cov, and if that's set, we're going to use libcov express, and if not, we're going to use whatever libexpress is. So that is how Express gets included into our application. That's how the require statement works, the require function works in Node.js. And with that knowledge, we can start writing much cleaner Node programs. So until next week, happy coding, and of course, happy New Year, because that's going to happen before we meet again. If you found this episode useful, or if it saved you some time, would you consider spreading the word by either sharing it on Facebook, tweeting it, or even just linking to it from elsewhere on the interwebs? Thanks a bunch.